This was Ireland's population in 1841, but this was the country's population by the end of 1851. In just a decade, the population was reduced by over 1.5 million. But how? The year is 1845 and one of the deadliest famines is taking over Ireland, a period that later became known as the Great Famine. While people around the world believe that this famine was caused by potato blight, the truth is much more sinister than that. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell, England's military titan, leads his army to brutally decimate the Irish population, which is where the chaos truly begins. Ireland's population was reduced by 41%, and those who survived were banished to the barren lands of the West, while thousands were shipped off to distant shores as virtual slaves. But the oppression didn't end there. Shortly afterwards, the penal laws were imposed upon Ireland in 1695, stripping its people of language, religion, and the very right to learn. Irish folks became strangers in their own land, trapped in a cycle of poverty and ignorance, while English landlords lorded over their vast estates. Imagine, the year is 1801 and Ireland has now become part of the UK thanks to the Acts of Union. Now, before this happened, Ireland had its parliament. After joining the UK, Ireland sends 105 members to the House of Commons, but only 28 Irish folks can sit in the House of Lords, all of whom are chosen by other aristocrats. Then comes the year 1829, and Daniel O'Connell manages to secure Catholic emancipation for his people. But even this effort turns out to be too little too late for the downtrodden Irish. By this point, they're already absorbed in a life of destruction, surviving on only potatoes grown in unforgiving soil. But simultaneously, several other things were going on. This is how the first half of the 18th century unfolded in Ireland. Landlords had these guys called middlemen to collect rent from tenants, and these middlemen made sure the landlords got their cash while handling the dirty work. But here's the thing, these middlemen would then lease big chunks of land from the landlords, then chop these up into smaller bits and rent them out for a profit. This left the poor tenants, who were mostly Catholics, stuck in a tough spot. They had to pay high rents and work hard for the landlords just to make ends meet. And if they couldn't pay up, or if the landlords felt like switching from crops to sheep farming, they could get evicted, no questions asked. It was a brutal cycle of exploitation. At the top of this messed up pyramid was the ascendancy class, which basically consisted of rich English and Anglo-Irish families who owned most of the land and called all the shots. These folks lived it up in England while their Irish tenants barely scraped by. And where was the money they made from these struggling farmers? Well, it was shipped off to England. In 1843, the British government finally woke up to the fact that this land system was causing chaos in Ireland. They set up this commission to investigate, but even the commission mostly had landlords in charge. And when the commission reported back, they described scenes of people living in shabby cabins, surviving on just potatoes and water, with no security and no hope. See, the problem was that the tenants had no incentive to improve their land because when their lease was up, everything they'd built belonged to the landlord. But right before the famine hit, there were several other factors in play. Let's go back to 1700, when Ireland's population was merely at 2 million. By the time it was the mid-1800s, this population had increased by 4 times, standing at 8 million right before disaster struck. With more people, land started getting chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces. By 1845, nearly a quarter of all farms were less than 5 acres, and a hefty 40% were between 5 to 15 acres. These were tiny plots, barely enough to grow potatoes to feed a family. And get this, before the famine, a third of these farms couldn't even support the families living on them. People were scraping by, often relying on seasonal work in England and Scotland just to make ends meet. Originally, potatoes were just a fancy garden crop for the rich folks, but by the late 17th century, they were everything, even though people were still mostly eating butter, milk, and grains. Fast forward to the late 1700s and early 1800s, and the economy was booming, thanks to infrastructure projects and wars in Europe that meant big demand for food. So farmers started growing tons of potatoes because they were quick to grow and packed a nutritional punch. Soon, nearly 1 in 3 Irish people were consuming potatoes, especially during winter. They were a lifesaver, keeping people fed year-round. But here's where it gets dicey. Most of these potatoes were a type called the Irish lumper. They were easy to grow, but they lacked genetic diversity, which meant they were sitting ducks for diseases. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Before the infamous blight hit, there were already a couple of potato diseases floating around, but none of them were too serious until the Phytophthora infestans came into the picture in 1845. Also known as blight, this wasn't your typical fungus. It was an oomycete, which is like a distant cousin of algae but still just as destructive. The first whispers of doom hit the headlines in August 1845, with reports of a fearful malady destroying crops. Irish newspapers were full of stories about this mysterious potato sickness. And then, on September 13, 1845, it was official. Blight had invaded Ireland. Panic ensued, but the British government was slow to react, brushing off early warnings as exaggerations. But when harvest time rolled around in October, there was no denying the devastation. 1/3 to 1/2 of all potato crops were wiped out, leaving people scrambling for food. But nothing was as bad as when this blight returned with a vengeance in 1846. This wasn't just a setback, it was a full-blown catastrophe. For 4 agonizing years, Ireland was plunged into a nightmare of hunger and disease. Blight took down 3/4 of the harvest, leaving millions facing starvation. Seed potatoes were scarce, and hunger became the new normal. By 1847, over 3 million Irish souls were hanging by a thread, relying solely on potatoes for survival. But with yields dwindling, famine tightened its grip, casting a shadow of despair across the land. This is the west of Ireland, the area that got hit the worst, with some countries losing over half of their population. But the horrors didn't end there. The famine's impact rippled through the years, leaving a scar on Ireland's economic and political landscape. Mass emigration became the new normal, my friend. People fled their homeland in droves, seeking refuge from the relentless grip of poverty and despair. Between 1845 and 1855, over 1.3 million people emigrated outside of Ireland. Over 70% of these migrants went to the USA, while 28% went to Canada and 2% headed to Australia. While the numbers weren't as high as the Irish people who emigrated to the USA, thousands of Irish went to Britain. In America, most Irish people became city dwellers, and by 1850, Irish people made up 1/4 of the population in NYC, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. This is Ireland's population in 1891, which had gone below 5 million. And then, this is the population in 1931, standing at a little over 4 million. It wasn't until the 1960s that Ireland's population started to increase once again. It's interesting to note that Ireland's population went beyond the population recorded in the census of 1851 for the very first time in 2016. This meant it took almost a century and a half to make up the difference. To this day, people are still debating who's to blame for the famine. Irish nationalists were convinced it was all Britain's fault, and they used it as ammunition for their fight for self-governance. A man named Mitchell spoke his mind, revealing his displeasure at how the British handled things. He even wrote a book called The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps, in 1861, where he straight up accused the British of genocide. He famously said, "The Almighty sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine." But guess what? Mitchell wasn't let off easy. Nah, he got slapped with a sedition charge for speaking his mind. They shipped him off to Bermuda for 14 years, but that's a whole other story. During the famine, voices were constantly raised, arguing that Ireland should keep its own food until everyone was fed, instead of being shipped off to England, especially when they had nothing left to feed themselves. But turns out that wasn't the plan across the pond. But here's the thing, no matter who you blame, one fact remains crystal clear. The famine tore a hole through Ireland's heart. It left a bitter taste in the mouth of the Irish, fueling their desire for independence, which they eventually managed to gain from the British in 1922. After the famine, it was also noted that a good chunk of Irish men and women were opting out of marriage altogether, with as many as 1/3 of men and 1/4 of women never taking the plunge. Why? Well, it boils down to low wages and tough economic times that aren't exactly conducive to starting a family. This also contributed to the steadily declining population. But here's where it gets tough. With more kids losing their parents to the famine, some young women were left with no choice but to turn to prostitution to make ends meet. During the 1840s, Ottoman Sultan Abdülmecid lent a helping hand to Ireland by chipping in £1,000 for famine relief efforts in Ireland. Now, that might not sound like a lot of cash today, but back then it was a pretty hefty sum. In terms of today's money, we're talking somewhere between $84,000 and $216,000. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Legend has it that the Sultan originally wanted to donate a whopping £10,000. However, rumour has it that either British diplomats or his own ministers convinced him to dial it back to just £1,000. Why? Well, they didn't want to ruffle any feathers by donating more than Queen Victoria herself, who had pitched in £2,000. Now, there's some debate about whether the Sultan also sent over 3 or 5 ships packed with food to help out. The records are a bit fuzzy, and there are conflicting reports about whether these ships actually made it up the River Boyne to deliver their aid. But regardless, the gesture didn't go unnoticed. In fact, the people of Drogheda were so grateful for the Sultan's generosity that they put up a plaque in the town hall to honour him. The year is 1879 and the potato blight hits the country once again, but this time the Irish aren't going down without a fight. Led by the Land League and folks like Michael Davitt, who had experienced eviction firsthand as a child during the famine, the Irish start boycotting notorious landlords and even physically block evictions. The authorities crack down hard, with nearly 1,000 people thrown in jail under the Coercion Act for their involvement. But despite the tough times, there's a glimmer of hope. With fewer people losing their homes and stronger community networks forming, the impact of the second, shorter famine is somewhat softened. In the later part of the 1800s and early 1900s, Ireland was buzzing with the spirit of nationalism, especially among the Catholic community. Daniel O'Connell, a prominent figure in Irish politics, led the charge for change. Despite facing obstacles like being unable to take his seat in Parliament because of his religion, O'Connell didn't back down. Once in office, he kept pushing for Ireland to break free from British rule, but unfortunately, his efforts to repeal the Act of Union didn't quite pan out. Then comes the year 1913 and tensions are rising. The idea of Home Rule for Ireland is gaining traction, but not everyone's on board. The Ulster Volunteers are dead set against it, and to counter them, the Irish Volunteers are formed, aiming to make Home Rule a reality. And while the Home Rule Bill is passed, it comes with a catch. 6 countries in Ulster get left out, paving the way for what would become Northern Ireland. Then in 1916, things came to a head with the Easter Rising. Rebels take a stand against British rule, but it doesn't end well. The British response is harsh, but it only fuels the fire of Irish republicanism. The year is 1918 when Sinn Féin, a pro-independence party, won big in the general election. They proclaimed an Irish republic and set up their own parliament, kicking off a 3-year guerrilla war against British rule. Finally, in 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, giving Ireland some independence but keeping Northern Ireland in the UK. This leads to a bitter civil war between those in favour of the treaty and those against it. The Free State eventually emerges victorious, but not without scars. As Ireland moves into the mid-20th century, things start to change. The country stays neutral during World War II, but secretly helps out the Allies. After the war, there was a wave of emigration, but by the late 1980s, the economy started picking things back up, earning Ireland the nickname Celtic Tiger thanks to a period of rapid growth. Eventually, after breaking free from British rule, Ireland began to heal. Today, the population of Ireland stands at over 7 million, boasting its successful economy and progress. If you like this video, maybe you'll like our other ones too. See you guys in the next one.